Okay, and we're back with the Jay Metter CFP and Chris Peterson estate planning attorney presentation. And what we're doing now is talking about long-term care planning. First of all, Chris, what is long-term care?
So long-term care is basically skilled care that someone needs for at least 90 consecutive days. So it's once you get past 90 days, hit the 91st day, you're considered to have needed long-term care. And what it practically means from a CFP standpoint is this is a question that is becoming more and more asked. And so I think a real part of estate planning in kind of modern America is also what are you going to do to plan for long-term care?
Right, exactly. So tell us the good news and bad news of long-term care, basically.
Well, the good news of long-term care is that in modern America, we're living longer. And that is a positive thing, but it's also a thing that has kind of got a flip side to it.
Right.
In the current year, according to the Social Security Administration, now American males are living to age 84, and American females are outliving us by a couple years to age 86. But the bad news is that typically we're almost all needing long-term care at some point in time. So 70% of adults that are over age 65 will need long-term care at some point during their lifetime. That is a huge statistic.
That definitely is huge.
And what's crazy about that is that need is also extending. So in general, men are going to need at least 2.2 years worth of long-term care at some point, and women generally need 3.7 years of long-term care. And it's about 20% of that population that needs long-term care actually needs it for longer than 5 years. So I mean, you can see it, the numbers are staggering, to the point that I'm thinking about quitting practicing law and going into the nursing home business.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, you look at all the baby boomers and everybody else coming down, and you think, well, who's going to provide care for all these people?
That's right. You do think about it, and I think what we see in our office is a lot of unpaid caregivers, and I think the stats kind of bear that out. When you look at the Department of Health and Human Services, what they tell us is that 80% of all caregivers for long-term care are not paid, which is amazing. Those unpaid caregivers, which are usually family members, on average spend greater than 20 hours a week providing care, so which is amazing. 1 in 4 adults in the United States are unpaid caregivers. That's over 65 million adults in the United States that are providing care to family members. 2/3 of those caregivers are women, which is probably not a big surprise. But I think the thing that is shocking is that 14% of those caregivers are over the age of 65.
Wow.
So you really have those who are considered elderly caring for the elderly.
Right.
So it's a big problem, it's a big issue, and it's something that you're going to see every day in your practice.
Yep. Well, we know that Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care. So talk to us about that just a little bit.
Yeah, so most people are really confused about that because they say, oh, well, I have Medicare and so my long-term care is covered. And the fact is that your long-term care isn't covered under Medicare.
Right.
What Medicare does is they will pay for what's termed long-term care services if you are also receiving skilled services or rehabilitative care. And they're only going to do it for up to 100 days. And so It's not going to pay for non-skilled services. If you need services for help with sort of normal life activities, it doesn't pay for that at all. So, Medicare is not going to cover you in this realm.
Well, of course, cost of long-term care is just going crazy, and it's only going to get worse at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of care in the United States is huge. These are not my stats. They come straight from the Department of Health and Human Services. And they're also projecting not only what did care cost in the year 2012, but what will care cost 25 years from now in 2037. And the thing that's crazy is when you look at having a private room in a nursing home, in 2012 in Texas, you're looking at paying $61,000 for that on average. In 2037, the cost is projected to be $108,000. Assisted living right now is projected at $40,000 on average. In 2037, it's projected at $153,000 annually. Those are staggering numbers. And so the question becomes, how is the average person going to pay for that care? Because do you have an extra $153,000 sitting around in your bank account where you can pay for care?
And that's only 1 year.
And that's only 1 year.
Right.
So, and what's worse is what happens if both mom and dad are in care.
Right.
Right. So, it's a staggering number and one that is very sobering.
Yeah, it really is. So then, of course, it's how does somebody pay for long-term care in a situation like that?
Yeah, you basically are going to have to, you're either going to have to privately pay, which could be you paying outright, or it could be you insuring against the risks, something that you've undertaken to pay, or you're going to have to rely on public assistance. I mean, those are really the only two choices.
Well, and then long-term care, of course, impacts retirement. I try to tell my clients, take a small portion of your money and invest it so that you can at least have a larger portion for yourself, as opposed to having to use that for long-term care itself through insurance and things like that. So in any event, but let's talk about that, how long-term care impacts retirement.
Yeah, let's be honest. Most people in the modern day, they have a hard enough time going ahead and saving for their own retirement. Mm-hmm. So now essentially what you're asking them to do is not just save for their retirement, but also save as much or more for their long-term care needs.
Right.
And so it has a tremendous impact on their savings and on their retirement. We know in the United States, people don't save enough, right? I mean, every government study that's been done in the last 50 years says that everybody doesn't save enough.
Right.
And so when you think about not saving enough for retirement, for most of your clients, long-term care isn't even on their radar unless they've personally had to write out of their pocket to make up the difference for mom or dad in the nursing home. So it has a tremendous impact. The other thing that often happens is people will need long-term care. The only source of funds that they have for long-term care is their retirement savings, and essentially their retirement savings get eaten up paying for this long-term care.
And taxed, because they're having to pull out huge chunks, which puts them in a higher tax bracket at that point too.
That's exactly right. And so you've got this dwindling nature and then sort of a faster spend because of the tax impact. And then the big question is, if it's a married couple, and one of them needs long-term care, well, they're spending the retirement proceeds of the other spouse, right?
Exactly.
On that care. And so what you have is you're at the same time you're caring for one spouse, you're essentially impoverishing the other long-term. And so the question of the left behind spouse is a big one.
Right. I already just briefly mentioned long-term care insurance, but besides that, or maybe even talk about that a little bit, what are the three ways to pay for long-term care?
Well, you're basically gonna either make a lot of money and pay for it out of your pocket, you're gonna buy long-term care insurance, or you're gonna qualify for public assistance, which is basically Medicaid, because we already talked about Medicare doesn't do it. Now, I personally recommend the first one. So if you have the ability to make a lot of money and save a lot of money and pay for long-term care out of your pocket, that's a good thing. I had a client just this week that was kind of funny. Is a new client, never met him before. You know, he's coming into the office for the first time. We started talking through his estate. We hadn't gotten to his assets yet. I asked him if he had a plan for long-term care, and he just told me, he said, "Chris, I'm good on that." And clients always tell you they're good on everything. So, you know, I was like, now look, I want to tell you that if you don't have long-term care insurance, we were talking about his insurance. I said, if you don't have long-term care insurance, I really think, you know, maybe I should make some recommendations to you about maybe who you could use and talk about it. And he goes, no, Chris, I'm good on this. And I said, now, you know, are you sure? Because, I mean, this is something that really most people need, and it's a huge issue. And he goes, Chris, I have $28 million in liquid cash.
He's good on that.
And I said, you're good on it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about long-term care insurance. So it was a funny conversation. But absent the guy that walks into your office and has $28 million in securities,
Right.
You probably want to talk to them about long-term care insurance.
Absolutely.
And but it is important to know that it has kind of a safety net and a fallback that Medicaid is available if that is really your only option. Now, sometimes there's some other options. You might look at reverse mortgages. Sometimes there's VA benefits that will fill in. Sometimes if it's not extended care, sometimes you can get Medicare kind of Medigap policies that'll pay for some care. Some people will essentially self-fund through the use of annuities that'll pay out for the cost of care, or maybe have a rider on them to pay for long-term care. But at the end of the day, those are all forms of one or two, right? They're either forms of making money and paying for it, or somehow insuring against it.